Okay, this lecture goes hand in hand with the discussion of Aristotle's soul, the one that's called Aristotle De Anima Psychology. The destruction of our natural environment is becoming self-evident. Philosophers need to render an account of the theories of reality, including nature, and human culture, that have led us to this point, and explain what the most recent scientific discoveries tell us about who we are and the kind of universe we live in. We know that the discoveries of Copernicus, Newton, Kepler, Galileo, and many others, modern science ushered in a new paradigm. We know that Francis Bacon argued that the purpose of knowledge is to exploit nature for human well-being. The Industrial Revolution resulted in centuries of such exploitation. We have now come to the point where we either change our paradigm or destroy ourselves and much of the ecosystem that sustains us. The focus of this paper will not be on the various conclusions drawn about what exists and what we know. Rather, the focus will be on one of the underlying assumptions beneath all of the discussions, the nature of the knower. My contention is the modern paradigm ushered in a seriously flawed reductionist psychology that we must examine and replace with a much more complex view. We will not be able to save our existence on Earth without an examination of the powers of the human soul and how they need to be exercised in order for us to save our ecosystem and ourselves. Aristotle's On the Soul is an excellent example of a complex and comprehensive view of the powers of the human soul as naturally emerging from the nature of the environment out of which it developed. The powers of the souls of plants, animals, and human beings come to be in relation to what already exists. They are immaterial entities that rely on material components, but that come to be and exist in a relational dimension of reality. This way of understanding the human soul is strikingly similar to what system scientists are saying. As early as 1929, Alfred North Whitehead was constructing a worldview process philosophy to explain the nature of the universe after relativity had been accepted by scientists as the best model of the natural world. From the point of view of causality, Whitehead claims, the extreme rejection of final causation from our categories of explanation has been fallacious. The two spheres of operation, the formal cause, the immaterial cause, and the material cause, should be interwoven and required, each by the other. Psychologically, Whitehead distinguishes between two different powers of the human soul, both called reason. Speculative reason is the capacity to create a holistic theory of everything. It aims for ideas about the greatest human good, the nature of God, and the purpose of human life. Whitehead points out that, quote, the conduct of human affairs is entirely dominated by our recognition of foresight determining purpose, and purpose issuing in conduct. Unquote. The power of the human soul Whitehead calls speculative reason is the power to articulate these purposes. The function of speculative reason is to promote the art of life. The primary function of reason is to constitute, emphasize, and criticize the final causes and strength of aims directed toward them. Apart from this primary function, the very existence of reason is purposeless and its origin is inexplicable. In the course of evolution, why should the trend have arrived at humankind if the activities of reason remain without influence on his bodily action? Reason is inexplicable if purpose be ineffective. Unquote. The sciences arise from the use of completely different power of the rational human soul. The power Whitehead calls, quote, the short-range function of reason. Reason criticizing and emphasizing the subordinate purposes in nature, which are the agents of final causation. This is reason as pragmatic agent, unquote. The sciences focus on how things work, and on whether a speculative idea about goodness, truth, and beauty can be worked out in the concrete world of physical forces, objects, and human beings. Quote, in this function, reason is the practical embodiment of the urge to transform mere existence into the good existence, and to transform the good existence into the better existence. These two functions of reason, or two powers of the human soul, are very different, yet they complement each other and need each other. Speculative ideas without any concern for how they will be realized in concrete behavior are meaningless and do not promote progress. Pragmatic concerns about how things work and the desire simply to get results can end in the development of a culture without any goals or with the wrong goals. In his development of process philosophy, Whitehead reintroduced the human capacity for speculative reason and applied it to what physics implies about the nature of reality. To gain inspiration, Whitehead refers to the Greeks. Greek philosophy is the product of the use of speculative reason. Quote, "The real importance of the Greeks for the progress of the world is that they discovered the almost incredible secret that speculative reason was itself subject to orderly method. They robbed it of its anarchic character without destroying its function of reaching beyond set bounds. That is why we now speak of the speculative reason in the place of inspiration." The Greeks, the Greeks invented logic in the broadest sense of that term, the logic of discovery. The Greek logic, as finally perfected by the experience of centuries, provides a set of criteria to which the content of a belief should be subjected. They are conformity to intuitive experience, clarity of the propositional content, internal logical consistence, external logical consistence, status of a logical scheme, with widespread conformity to experience, no discordance with experience, concordance among its categorical notions, methodological consequences. The product of a scheme is a major effort of the speculative, the production of a scheme is a major effort of the speculative reason. It involves imagination far outrunning the direct observations. This is what I would say the correspondence theory between what you think and what's actually out there. Whitehead describes Aristotle as the Greek philosopher who most tried to integrate the two functions of reason, because he was an empirical scientist and because he understood his scientific observations and conclusions as part of a much larger universe, driven both by final and efficient or material causes. Whitehead and I agree that the notion of final cause should never have been abandoned in the modern era. Ernst Laszlo, 70 years later, after a surge in scientific knowledge that assumes both relativity theory and quantum mechanics, Ervin Laszlo's in the system's view of the world presents a view of the universe agreed upon by scientists in many fields that represents the kind of speculative, comprehensive worldview Whitehead advocated. As Whitehead predicted, the key element in the formation of human society, according to Laszlo, is a power of the human soul, the power of what system scientists call reflective consciousness. This power, says Laszlo, seems to be a uniquely human property, and it's the basis for a long series of other properties, all of which presuppose in some way the ability not only to perceive and feel things, but to know that one perceives and feels them, and hence to order them in the light of one's purposes." Unquote. Reflective consciousness depends upon the development of language. Quote, "It is relatively easy to tell whether an organism possesses reflective consciousness by noting whether it had developed a language and other symbolic modes of expression and communication, and whether it can transcend the limits of the here and now by making plans not directly triggered by actual stimuli. Man alone passes this test." Laszlo and Whitehead agree on the place of the imagination in formulating a picture of the kind of life one wants to live. Quote, "When we evolved the capacity to substitute imaginative satisfactions for real ones, we also became saddled with the capacity to feel, to envision, and to believe." Given the new system science understanding of reality in the human soul, the goal of every life is what Laszlo calls fulfillment. Fulfillment means the realization of human potentials for existence as a biological and a socio-cultural being. It means bodily as well as mental health. It means adaptation to the environment as a biological organism, constituting an irreducible whole of its parts, and as a socio-cultural role carrier, collaboratively constituting the multi-person systems in his or her society. This new systems-based ethic is a certain kind of humanism. Quote, our humanistic goal is to enhance individual fulfillment in an increasingly deterministic, multi-leveled society composed of greatly differentiated individuals. Laszlo's description of the development is of this development as the formulation of a new sphere, taken from the Greek word for mind, is very important for setting up a meaningful comparison between Aristotle and systems thinking today. Laszlo limits his comments to the great religions and says they, quote, could celebrate the evolution of the new sphere in Earth as the next and especially significant phase in the world's evolutionary self-creation. They could help us recognize our journey as individuals within the Earth's bio-noosphere reflects the evolutionary journey of the cosmos, that the self-creating universe is our larger self. Unquote. I agree with Laszlo's basic vision, and I've argued that I think Aristotle would agree also. However, the systems view needs to be supplemented with a comprehensive, systematic, and realistic assessment of the powers of the human soul and how they must be educated in order to actually lead people toward the development of the new sphere Laszlo so urgently desires. Aristotle's view of the soul and its education provides such a necessary supplement to the system sciences today. Dr. Paul Davies, professor of theoretical physics, has written extensively on the connection between current discoveries in physics and what they imply for the overall speculative view of the universe, the human soul, and human culture. In his book, God and the New Physics, Davies discusses what the new holistic sciences imply for the nature of the human soul. Davies asks the age-old question, what is the mechanism whereby matter acts on mind, and, worse still, mind on matter? Unquote. Like Whitehead and Laszlo, Davies rejects both the materialism and the dualism of Enlightenment thinkers. Davies seems to claim that all religious doctrines contains implicitly or explicitly a dualistic theory of the mind. Quote, central to religious doctrine is the idea that the soul or mind is a thing, and a sharp distinction must be drawn between body and soul. Unquote. Much like the other system scientists, Davies claims that the mind is not either a material thing or a separable substance, but comes into being as a result of the complex interrelationships between people responding to the outside environment and the kind of thinking processes going on in their brains. Quote, mind and body are not two components of a duality, but two entirely different concepts drawn from different levels in a hierarchy of description. Unquote. I will point out that Davies and Laszlo disagree about religion. Laszlo says the insights of the religions can be integrated with systems theory. The mind comes into being through this dynamic relationship between different physical entities. We describe those relationships through words or concepts. This does not mean mind is nothing more than a concept. Mind is a real entity and acts as both cause and effect in human behavior. It's called a concept because its nature is defined through concepts. Quote, the dualistic theory falls into the trap of seeking a substance, the mind, to explain what is really an abstract concept, not an object. The fact that a concept is abstract rather than substantial does not render it somehow unreal or illusory. Concepts like usefulness, organization, entropy, and information do not involve a thing in the sense of object, but relationships between and conditions of objects. Davies' description of mind is very similar to Laszlo's description of the system's view. Quote, abstract, high-level concepts can be equally as real as the low-level structures that support them, without any mysterious extra substances or ingredients. Just as a life force is an unnecessary addition for matter to become animate, so a soul substance is unnecessary for matter to become conscious. This is also Aristotle. Remember, thought thinking itself. The mind begins to reflect on itself, and that is detached that only becomes activated after the sensations, perceptions, memory, all of those things have developed. So Aristotle also has a holistic idea of mind. Like Whitehead and Laszlo, Davies recognizes the physical foundation for mental activities, but argues that the quantum view of the universe shows the existence of real worlds over and above their physical parts. Quote, the brain consists of billions of neurons buzzing away, oblivious to the overall plan. This is the physical mechanical world of electrochemical hardware. On the other hand, we have thoughts, feelings, emotions, volitions, and so on. This higher level, holistic mental world is equally oblivious to the brain cells. We can happily think while being totally unaware of any help from our neurons. Unquote. As Davies associates his view with what he calls the cognitive sciences. Quote, the two-level or multi-level description of mind and body is a great improvement on the old idea of dualism, mind and body as two distinct substances, or materialism, mind does not exist. It is a philosophy that's rapidly gaining ground with the emergence of what are known as the cognitive sciences, artificial intelligence, computing science, linguistics, cybernetics, and psychology. All these fields of inquiry are concerned with systems that process information in one way or another, whether man or machine. The development of concepts and language associated with computers, such as the distinction between hardware and software, has opened up new perspectives on the nature of thought and consciousness. It has forced scientists to think more clearly than ever before about the mind. Unquote. The new philosophy of mind associated with the cognitive sciences is called functionalism. Quote, functionalists recognize that the essential ingredient of mind is not the hardware, the stuff your brain is made of, or the physical processes that it employs, but the software, the organization of the stuff, or the program. They do not deny that the brain is a machine and that neurons fire purely for electrical reasons, yet they still appeal to causal relations between mental states. Very crudely, thoughts cause thoughts, notwithstanding the fact that, at the hardware level, the causal links are already forged. The mind, then, is not a substance, but rather an emergent property. It is natural, but not for that reason exclusively material. Quote, once matter and nature are understood as including realities over and above the material parts, the mind can be considered natural, and the question of whether it could outlive the particular body within which it first developed can still be left an open question, a possibility. Liberating mind from the confines of the human body leaves open the question of immortality. The software description of the mind does not logically require neurons. It allows for the existence of disembodied minds. What stuff is the soul made of? The question is as meaningless as asking what stuff citizenship or Wednesdays are made of. The soul is a holistic concept. It is not made of stuff at all. Where is the whole soul located? Nowhere. To talk of the soul as being in a place is as misconceived as trying to locate the number 7 or Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. Such concepts are not in space at all. Unquote. So, on the one hand, a mind is more than its physical parts, but on the other hand, are the physical parts always necessary, even if not sufficient to keep the mind alive? Davies addresses this question with more questions. Quote, we may therefore choose to reject the belief that mind is nothing but brain cell activity, for that is to fall into the reductionist trap. Nevertheless, it seems that the existence of the mind is supported by that activity, and so the question arises of how disembodied minds can exist. To resort yet again to an analogy, a novel is built out of words, but the story could equally well be stored vocally on magnetic tape, coded on punch cards, or digitally on computer, for example. Can the mind survive the death of the brain by being transferred to some other mechanism or system? Clearly this would be possible in principle. So again, this sounds very much like Aristotle. Okay. Even with the possibility of the mind or soul outliving the body, Most people would agree that there are some aspects of their experiences while alive in a body that they do not expect or even want to outlive the existence of their bodies. Davies addresses this, quote, "Most people, however, do not contemplate the survival of their entire personality. So much of our makeup is tied to our bodily needs and capacities. Sexuality, for example, in the absence of a body or a need for procreation, would be ridiculous. Many would also not wish for the negative aspects of their personality, the greed, jealousy, hatred, and so forth, to survive. The enduring core of mind would have to be stripped of its more obviously bodily associations and unpleasant features. But would anything be left?" Unquote. In distinguishing between the aspects of personhood which might outlive the body and those that would not, Davies makes a very important distinction between memory and self-awareness. On the one hand, quote, "our conceptions of ourselves as strongly rooted in our memory of past experiences. If a person did lose the ability to remember the experiences of even a few seconds previously, his sense of identity would completely disintegrate. It is thus largely through memory that we achieve a sense of personal identity," unquote. But memory is clearly connected to our experiences in the material world. Quote, "If the soul depends upon the brain for memory, how can the soul remember anything after the death of the body?" Unquote. Davies' key point here is to distinguish between mere awareness, brought about by experiences in relation to the outside world, and self-awareness, a level of consciousness seemingly unique to the human species, and a level of reality that emerges from the complexity with which we process and come to think about our experiences and our memories of those experiences. Quote, "Human consciousness does not consist of awareness, but of self-awareness. We know that we know. The quality of self-reference is a key one in unraveling the mystery of the mind. There seems to be a natural progression from the inanimate through the animate to the conscious, a hierarchy of complexity and self-organization. But there's another hierarchy buried in this progression, a hierarchy of conceptual levels. Life is a holistic concept, the reductionist perspective revealing only inanimate atoms with us. Similarly, mind is a holistic concept at the next level of description. The property of self-awareness is holistic and cannot be traced to specific electrochemical mechanisms in the brain." Unquote. At this level of self-awareness, human beings become conscious of themselves as knowers. They know that they know and that they can and must make their own decisions about how to live based on their own concepts of the good life. Quote, "Consciousness, the impression of free will, and the sense of personal identity all involve an element of self-reference. During introspection, an observer observing himself, both subject and object coincide." Quote, "The way the mind develops, then, is that at birth the brain is becoming physically larger and larger. The parts are developing more and more through interaction with the outside world, until at a certain point of development the brain becomes self-reflective, and the mind emerges in a level of reality in which the source of behavior and emotion is now based on thoughts." This is when Aristotle says, if you remember, you go from sensation to perception, to imagination to memory, to experience, and then, remember, with recollection, you recollect, you recognize. It's that leap to self-conscious awareness that you're deliberately trying to remember your memories in a certain way, that you're trying to get meaning, or you're trying to look at your observations of the natural world with a view to seeing the patterns. That's the next level of development, and that's a quantum leap. That's a leap from your connection to the material world. We define people most by the way they think about the great questions in life, the concepts that drive adult human beings to make the choices they make and live the kinds of lives they live. Davies says, quote, "The hardware of brain cells and electrochemical machinery supports the software level of thought, ideas, decision, which in turn couple back to the neural level and so modify and sustain their own existence. It's the very entanglement of the levels that makes you you," unquote. Ultimately, an individual's identity, in the most real sense, is a function of the way they process information, stimuli from the outside world, stimuli from different parts of the brain, chemical reactions, etc. The way they process information is governed most of all by the abstract concepts they focus on to make sense of and to serve as guides for making choices and for the reasons upon which their choices are based. Davies concludes, quote, "The essential ingredient of mind is information. It's the pattern inside the brain, not the brain itself, that makes us what we are. If the mind is basically organized information, then the medium of expression of that information could be anything at all. It need not be a particular brain, or indeed any brain. We are more like messages in circuitry, and the message itself transcends the means of expression." So, for example, in ethics, remember when he said all actions are for the sake of some good? So, good and evil are behavior. Once we become aware that we're reflective, that we think, once we start reflecting upon our sensations and our reactions, that's a whole different level of complexity, and that's what forms our identity. Is what we choose to do and why we choose to do it, which is our idea of the good. So in human action, imagination is always involved because you have to act, but once you get to a certain level, your action is controlled by your thought, unless it's clouded by appetite, if you remember, according to Aristotle. If the self is truly this level of reality, an immaterial relationship between and over and above the material parts, then the possibility of its transfer to a different kind of foundation, a non-material base, still exists. Davies leaves open the possibility of the immortality of the soul. Davies' position is both natural and consistent with the major religious tradition. Like Whitehead and other system scientists, the new view of matter as organized energy and the mind as a whole over and above the material parts leads to a position very much like the kind of life promoted by all major religions. Davies' functionalism leads to the same humanistic values as Laszlo and the other system scientists promote. Those values, in turn, can be positively correlated with the most universal values and ways of living promoted by religious traditions. Yet the real surprise is the astounding similarity between religious values from traditions that had no previous contact with each other. The explanation is that the source of these values is the natural emergence of human self-consciousness and the growth and development of cultural traditions as a result of the exercise of the power of reflective self-consciousness. Aristotle's view of the human soul clearly understands it as an emergent property and as originating in the self-conscious awareness of complexity. Aristotle then would be deeply engaged with scientists today, intensely curious about what we are learning about non-human organisms, about the nature of the cosmos as a whole, and about system science. Human beings possess, according to Aristotle, the powers of sense, perception, appetite, pleasure, pain, desire, imagination, and judgment in common with the other animals. Human beings are capable of being driven by appetites. Unreflective appetites, fears, pleasures, and pains in particular drive young children. The older they get, the more they develop memories, the more they're able to control appetite by thought, first because their authority figures model this and type of behavior. Later, they control their behavior according to their own ideas about the good life. Aristotle's discussion of the human imagination indicates that he took it seriously as a turning point in the development of both practical and theoretical wisdom. Human beings often make the wrong choices about how to live because of their image of the good person. The person they think is living the best human life is the wrong image. The two most prominent mistakes in this regard are the person who's rich and therefore can have whatever he wants, and the person who acts bravely in war and in politics and exercises power or receives high honor from his society. Wealth, power, and honor are goals that many human beings pursue as the final cause of human life. These goals are based on and controlled by the external environment. They are inherently transient. The world gives them and takes them away. Aristotle argues that as long as those goals are pursued as ends, all the other choices made are the wrong choices because they're pursued as means to the wrong ends. Someone might take a risk in war and face danger and be honored for it, but if the goal is only to be honored, they might take an unnecessary risk, or they might agree to fight in an unjust war simply to gain honor. These are not worthy goals and lead an individual and a society to ruin. The human imagination must be educated to develop an image of the person of practical wisdom. This person must have what Aristotle calls deliberative imagination, an awareness of the power of choice, and a desire to act based on what reason determines is best. Such people do not think of themselves as driven by outside circumstances and immediate responses to them, or as driven by irrational desires and appetites. The power to control desire by what reason determines is best is the next level of complexity and maturity. It's a necessary precondition for the achievement of wisdom as an adult. Okay. Aristotle presents a vision of the kind of society that emerges from a natural organism that has evolved within a universe that is inherently knowable, a creature whose natural purpose is to know. There are many, many senses in which one can be said to know. These can be prioritized as more and less complex types of knowing. Aristotle's description is what the system scientists would call a multi-level holarchy. Aristotle claims that once one knows, there's been an evolution from less complex to more complex, and after seeing the way each system depends on the previous one, Aristotle claims that one can come to the intuitive grasp of the existence of God in a certain sense. Aristotle describes God as a pure actuality or pure energy. Aristotle's notion of God is what the system scientists would call holistic. God is the whole over and above the sum of the parts. For example, the basic underlying substratum from which natural organisms have evolved is made up of elements that continually break down into different forms, but within which the overall amount of mass energy is preserved. On the systems theory, the underlying micro level is also extremely dynamic, making possible its formation into continually new species. Even though we never encounter energy as a thing over and above its manifestation in some material form, even if something is as elusive as a quark, we can still say that the universe is energy. Energy is holistic. Systems theorists also believe energy has taken on different forms in a way that demonstrates a pattern toward more and more complex kinds of things. Nature drives toward higher and higher levels of perfection. The notion of a principle of perfection toward which the universe has evolved and is still evolving is a holistic notion. It's a whole over and above the parts, a whole that explains why this pattern is so persistent. Systems theorists would say that being, as such, has a natural drive toward more and more perfect, more developed forms of being. Aristotle calls this principle toward which all things as a whole drive God. God is both the energy from which particular material beings come and the non-material good toward which material things as a whole evolve. The human mind, rational intuition, is capable of grasping this underlying principle of reality. Because reality is the way it is, and human beings are capable of grasping this intuitively, human beings whose souls are developed know themselves as members of a species whose natural purpose is to exercise all of the virtues and develop themselves to the highest level of perfection possible for them. With this model in mind, they can recognize both excellence and corruption in themselves and others. In On the Soul, Aristotle distinguishes between the specific power of the human soul to reflect on itself and recognize its place in the universe, and all the other powers of the soul. This power becomes active later in life than the others, and depends on the prior development of the other powers. In Book 3, Aristotle discusses, quote, the part of the soul with which the soul knows. First, Aristotle says, Thought must be related to what is thinkable, as sense is to what is sensible. In the case of the sensible, the material object was active, and the organ of sense evolved as a response to it and is activated by it. In the case of thought, the natural world is inherently ordered. The scientist goes from observation to knowledge of a species, and from knowledge of one species to knowledge of others, and to how they all relate to each other. Gradually, a scientist forms a mental image of the overall order of the natural object. This is the object of thought. It is reality insofar as it is thinkable. In matters of human action, the study of the soul, of ethics and politics, results in definitions of the powers of the human soul. These definitions are arrived at through observation and reflection, but the definitions themselves and an understanding of how they all relate to each other is an object of pure thought. In the study of all kinds of beings, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, and the wholes involved are objects of thought, or what Paul Davies calls concepts. As Davies says, it's not the case that such abstractions do not exist simply because they're not material. Rather, the abstractions are more real than mere matter because they describe the relationships between things, the overall whole that orders and is in control of the behavior of the parts. Davies and Laszlo would agree with Aristotle that the power of the soul that understands abstractions is not connected immediately to the body like the powers of sensation are. Aristotle says, quote, that in the soul which is called thought, by thought I mean that whereby the soul thinks and judges, is before it thinks not actually any real thing. For this reason it cannot reasonably be regarded as blended with the body, unquote. Davies and Laszlo would agree with Aristotle that the power of reflection is an emergent power. A child has to grow up observing, living, talking, before a young person at a certain stage of development begins to become self-conscious, and beyond that to reflect on the meaning of the fact that they possess knowledge, and knowledge is concerned with immaterial wholes. Quote, when thought has become each thing in the way in which a person who actually knows is said to do so, this happens when he's able to exercise the power on his own initiative. Its condition is still one of potentiality, but in a different sense from the potentiality which preceded the acquisition of knowledge by learning or discovering, and thought is then able to think itself, unquote. Aristotle describes the intellectual leap by which the mind begins to reflect on itself in this way. Flesh, quote, flesh and what it is to be flesh are discriminated either by different faculties or by the same faculty in two different states. Thought is itself thinkable in exactly the way as its objects are, for in the case of objects which involve no matter, what thinks and what is thought are identical, for speculative knowledge and its object are identical, unquote. The mind from birth is curious about the natural and human worlds, pursuing scientific knowledge and practical wisdom. At a certain point in this development, those who are forming a model of that order in nature and the hierarchy of virtues and activities in culture begin to see that the models are leading to a recognition that this very curiosity is the final cause of human life. The pursuit of wisdom is what we were meant to do. At this point, a transition is made. In investigating nature and culture, thought tries to absorb all that's going on outside of it. Quote, thought is what it is by virtue of becoming all things, unquote. But then it makes a quantum leap to a higher level of complexity, and it reflects on itself. Quote, there's another kind of thought which is what it is by virtue of making all things. This is a sort of positive state like light, unquote. In practical affairs, this is the transition from simply doing what one is told, to imitating another person's behavior, to studying the definitions of the virtues, and trying to give reason for one's actions. It's being able to see the connections between the individual virtues and connections between personal, social, and political virtues, to recognizing that practical wisdom is the culmination of this process. Once one gets this, the image and definitions become intuitively obvious, and a person becomes actively engaged, self-consciously aware of practical wisdom as one of the natural powers, and the synthesis of the natural power for acting well in the human soul. In science, the same process occurs, leading to an active engagement in inquiry for its own sake, as a power of the soul. Once people have self-consciously recognized the place of human beings in the universe, they know they are born to desire to know. Aristotle says in On the Soul that, quote, thought in this sense of it is separable, impassible, unmixed, since it is in its essential nature activity, for always the active is superior to the passive factor, the originating force to the matter. Quote unquote. Davies would agree with Aristotle that at this level the mind could outlive the physical body. Before the capacity for thought, for knowledge of the underlying principles and causes existed, a universe that was knowable already existed. Aristotle also claims that God exists and has always existed as a power that contains within it all the wisdom about first principles and causes that we only come to know later on and only partially. Again, God as the divine mind is a holistic concept. Simply because it is abstract and not material does not mean it does not exist. My main point here is not to get to the finer points of theology, and I don't mean to say God has consciousness, because that would be a projection of human beings. It's just a force. To point out that Laszlo and Davies both think system science is leading to conclusions about human nature that are perfectly consistent with the most universal ideas and recommendations for how to live embedded in all the great world's religions. A juxtaposition of Aristotle's view of God and the good life with the great world religions will lead to many insights and a leap in our ability to separate out universal values from the particular idiosyncrasies of each tradition. Aristotle had his biases and was blind and ignorant about many things, but his model is based on a view of nature and reality that's coming back through system science. It was a great tragedy, the Western intellectual tradition, that Aristotle's philosophy was controlled by Aristotelians who could not adapt it to the scientific discoveries of the modern era. Given Aristotle's notions of the powers of scientific reasoning and the place of science in relation to other powers, there was no need to think of modern science as a threat to Aristotle's view of human wisdom. Integrating the two positions would have provided a model through which to temper the then new ability to exploit natural resources through the new science and technology. Looking back, it was a mistake to think of God as approving of our unlimited exploitation of nature as long as we use those resources to improve the well-being of human beings. Aristotle's God was not human. Aristotle would have accused us of the greatest human evils, hubris, overstepping one's place in the universe, and greed, the desire for more than one needs. Together, we've now wreaked havoc on the natural world, on ourselves as individuals, and on the relationships between nations. So God as a force, we would just say that we're disrupting the force. We're not eliminating it, but we're clearly disrupting it so that energy is not being formed into systems the way it had been at the past, and our pollution and undermining of these systems creates new systems, but very unpredictable and unstable. Aristotle's model should be compared with system science to supplement their work because of his sophisticated view of the human soul and the power of human self-consciousness. Aristotle's view would give system scientists a much better model with which to educate people so they would eventually choose to habituate themselves to live within natural limits. Aristotle's model would require young people to be more self-aware about all the aspects of their lives. Aristotle's model would combine our relationships with nature and our relationships with each other and give us ways to understand the many, many aspects of a well-lived life and the many, many ways we can fail to achieve excellence. So if you think of all of his virtues and vices, Davies and Laszlo don't talk about all those things, And then in a future lecture, I will talk about Aristotle's view of tragedy. So he understands the way people make mistakes in judgment, how ignorant they are, how they're born ignorant, and all of these patterns are still true, and they're still part of us educating ourselves for wisdom. So, integrating systems theory with ancient Greek culture would integrate all the you would give you this model of the whole range of good and evil people are capable of. And understanding evil is very important so you're not fooled and you're not tempted. And ultimately, the same goal, we have the same goal as wisdom. But Laszlo and Davies are either naive or else they just didn't mention or didn't focus on all the obstacles to that goal. And that's what ancient Greek civilization can provide. Aristotle's model can also be used to supplement the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights because his concepts are less abstract than the concept of rights. Aristotle's view accounts for the critical importance of educating citizens so they will want to distribute wealth and power in ways that would lead to a strong middle class throughout the world. The list of human rights in the UN document presupposes or depends on the overall desire and skill to form a middle class and to raise people who take pleasure in moderation, so that middle means the meeting of real human needs, not a continual increase in the standard of living to the point where middle class includes more and more unnecessary goods. Using Aristotle as a model could be a way to find common ground among the world religions at a time when religion is being used to divide people. Since the turn of the millennium, when the world's religions should be unifying together to achieve population and pollution control as a necessary part of belief in and worship of any concept of God, religions have gone in the opposite direction. Using Aristotle as a model can unify the sciences with religion and the arts at a time when they appear to be at cross purposes. I will say not all religions have gone in the opposite direction. The religions of the book have, and Hinduism and Buddhism and other ones are very much concerned with the integration of culture and nature. Aristotle's spiritual humanism should replace modern Western secular humanism and be unified with the world's religions. Although Aristotle's view should not be the only or the final word, it's a good place to begin in forming the kind of global culture we need. Focusing on Aristotle's concept of the soul leads to the recognition of human dignity as well as of human ignorance, of the human soul as having entirely natural origins, and yet also possessing a power that could outlive the body. So, let me just summarize. In the previous lecture on the De Anima, Aristotle really describes human beings as a kind of animal. They have nutrition. He starts way back at the beginning. Sensation, perception, memory, imagination, and then they go, but they just, thought is an emergent property, and it emerges to the point where thought thinks itself and could perhaps outlive the body. All right, the quantum leap to recollection is the key here, to start deliberately remembering things in a certain way and start trying to understand the cause. Is also the point at which you realize that you can control your behavior. You realize it by thought. So that's the point at which practical wisdom becomes possible and theoretical wisdom becomes possible at the same moment of self-conscious awareness, that you are the thinking thing and that you can recognize patterns and that you're not going to be able to live well unless you do. So there's two directions that pattern recognition takes. One of them is in relationship to action, which is also always connected to desire, which is why you have to be habituated well, because you have to take pleasure in the right things in order to develop practical wisdom. And practical wisdom is the human good in action. And you're not going to act unless you desire. So appetites have to be trained, And then you have to develop an image in your mind of the person of practical wisdom. That image includes how they act in certain situations, um, because the human good is realized in action, in practical wisdom. Then you have theoretical wisdom, speculative reasoning. That is not inherently attached to any particular way of life or any particular choice. You have to have desired to understand the world in order to actually understand it. But what your conclusions about the science don't necessarily motivate you to act in one way or another. Desire motivates you. So ultimately, you want to synthesize those together, and you want to say that your discoveries of science have led you to conclude that we really need to integrate culture into nature. That would get you over to the practical wisdom side. And how are you going to construct a society where all aspects of the system are integrated? And one of the main virtues there is to seek everything in moderation and not to overstep your bounds. And so ultimately, they all need to fit together. Scientific discovery should lead to the desire to limit culture within the limitations of nature, and that has a particular meaning at this point in history because we're creating such a destabilizing we're such a destabilizing influence on these natural processes. But the overall principles are not going to change. There's going to be a principle of order and a principle of novelty that will be at work no matter what we do. And we could destroy ourselves. We can destabilize the systems as they have evolved so far, but that nature will continue to have a certain amount of material stuff, and there will be certain principles, forces involved. E equals mc squared, gravity, the weak nuclear force. All those other forces are still going to be there. There's going to be some stuff, and there's going to be this constant drive toward higher and higher levels of complexity. So we're obviously changing that because we're destroying species, and nature is adapting to all of our disrupting processes, but we are violating our natural purpose. Our natural final cause is to understand the world and not to change it to such an extent that we have no idea if we're going to preserve ourselves. And it's such a violation of our place in the universe. That's the main thing. It's such an incredible sin. It's hubris. But we can know that. So the idea is that's a holistic concept. Our minds are holistic, and our reflections on the universe and our place in it and our need to link culture and nature is the primary motive for creating a new sphere. So we do need to create an international new sphere that has those two basic intuitions. The universe is inherently ordered, our place is to understand it, and human culture has these patterns and order, and we need to recognize all those patterns, all the ways we can fail to integrate to achieve our final cause as the intelligent creature in an intelligible universe, all the ways that we fail to make a culture that is integrated with nature. And we need to develop a new sphere where we're constantly debating those questions, and we're formulating an international culture that there is a model for the best culture. And so the individual religions and circumstances that we started out in life with, we can ultimately synthesize into one big vision and use as a standard against which we guide our lives.